Today's lesson is the Big Bang of the Black Death. Hi, everybody. My name is Roger.
And I'm Mike.
And today, well, we're going to talk about a scientific concept here. We're not going to talk about the Big Bang of astronomy, and we're not going to talk specifically about the Black Death itself. We're going to try to talk about where the Black Death came from. Now, why should we talk about something that happened hundreds of years ago? Who cares?
Well, that's a very good question, but as we're dealing with COVID-19, a new disease that's come along and spread around the world, killing millions, I guess, at this point, it's kind of interesting to know about this sort of thing. And as much as we think the Black Death or the bubonic plague, is to give it one of its other names, is sort of a relic of the past, it's still out there. People still get the plague every year or so. I think there's always a few cases here and there. So it's also just interesting to know how these things start and how they spread and what a big effect they can have on human history.
Right, and because this happened so long ago, we need to have special techniques to try to figure out exactly where the Black Death came from, and hopefully that will help us better understand current diseases and plagues and pandemics as well. So let's get to it. Let's talk about the Big Bang of the Black Death. Let's listen to the first part of our lesson right now.
The Big Bang of the Black Death. A new study has revealed the likely source of a pandemic that decimated 14th century Europe. By analyzing DNA taken from 2 cemeteries in Kyrgyzstan, the study's authors found that the people in the graves had been killed by a strain of bacteria that later led to the Black Death, a plague which killed more than 20 million people throughout Europe.
大家好，我们可以看到第一部分的单字 analyze 这个字是动词，意思是分析。举例来说 ，The data must be analyzed before a conclusion can be made。那些资料得经过分析才能做出结论。或者 The detective had a special kit in order to analyze DNA samples。那位侦探有一个特殊工具包，用来分析 DNA 采样。另外补充这个字的名词 analysis。A-N-A-L-Y-S-I-S, analysis, 意思是分析。例如 Our next step will be to do an analysis of the data from this experiment. 我们的下一步将是分析这项实验的资料。或者 The business report includes an analysis of customer habits. 这份商业报告包含了顾客习惯的分析。接着我们看到单字 grave。它是名词，指的是墓地、公墓或是坟场。例如 Every week, my grandfather puts flowers on my grandmother's grave. 我爷爷每个礼拜都在我奶奶的坟上放花朵。另外补充这个字的同义名词 graveyard, G-R-A-V-E-Y-A-R-D, graveyard. 举例来说 In spite of being afraid of ghosts, Tammy bravely walked through the graveyard at night. 尽管害怕鬼 ，Tammy 还是勇敢地在夜间穿过了墓地。或者我们可以说 There is a graveyard next to my dorm. 我的宿舍旁边有一个坟场。再来我们可以看到名词 strain， 它的意思是病菌的类型，或是动植物的品种、株系。例如 Each year, new strains of the flu emerge and circulate around the world. 新的流感病毒株每年都会出现并散布至世界各地。或者 Vaccinations were useless against the new strain of the flu. 疫苗对这种新种流感无效。
Okay, so of course, if you're interested in physics and astronomy, you've probably heard about the Big Bang, which supposedly was the beginning of the universe. But we use this term, at least here, to talk about the beginning of something. And it's also a clever use in the title here because Black Death has a B sound, so the Big Bang of the Black Death.
All right, so let's get into the first paragraph. It says, a new study has revealed the likely source of a pandemic pandemic that decimated 14th century Europe. Wow, okay. So yeah, this is new science. I guess this is another interesting thing about it, is using new, more modern technology, we can learn things about the past that we never got the opportunity to know because we didn't have the science years ago. So this is new research, and it's revealed the likely source or the likely origin of a pandemic that decimated 14th century Europe. The Black Death is, of course, what we're talking about here. It decimated Europe in the 1300s. That would be the 14th century. To decimate, we use this word to basically kind of talk about destruction. If a place is decimated because of an earthquake or a typhoon or a war, it's been destroyed, or it's been very, very badly affected by a big, horrible kind of event. So that's what we're talking about here. It killed millions of people across Europe during the 14th century. And so some scientists have taken new science and found answers about this very old disease.
Exactly. So they're going back in time to 14th century Europe, and by analyzing DNA taken from 2 cemeteries in Kyrgyzstan, the study's authors found that the people in the graves had been killed by a strain of bacteria that later led to the Black Death, a plague which killed more than 20 million people throughout Europe. So if you analyze something, you look at something, you observe it, and you try to gain some information from it. In this particular case, they dug up graves and they opened the caskets, and they took out the bodies and they extracted DNA samples from those bodies. So they had samples there, and of course they got the bodies from cemeteries, and a cemetery is where they put the dead people when they die.
Very, very interesting. And then we read the study's authors found that the people in the graves had been killed by a strain of bacteria that later led to the Black Death, a plague which killed more than 20 million people throughout Europe. So this is kind of interesting. We'll find out exactly why they picked these bodies in this cemetery, but they found that the people in the graves had been killed by a certain type of bacteria. A grave is one of those individual holes that is dug for one body in a cemetery. A cemetery graveyard, that's a piece of land that is dedicated to holding the bodies of the dead in coffins and in other ways. And when you dig one of those holes to put the body in, the coffin is lowered down into the ground in this hole and then, of course, covered. That is a grave. At the head of the grave, you might have a gravestone, which is a marker, which might have a person's name and their date of birth and date of death. But that individual spot is a grave for one person, usually. And so people in these graves have been killed by a strain of bacteria. Here, strain is being used as a noun, so we're not straining orange juice or something like that. Here, a strain is basically a variety of a bacteria. We often use this when talking about things that grow. So a strain of bacteria, a strain of a certain culture in a lab that scientists are growing. You might have a certain strain of bacteria in your yogurt too, right? We have different strains of bacteria. Some are good, some are bad, some make us sick, some keep us healthy. But basically it's a type of bacteria, and the difference would be very important to scientists studying those things. So this strain of bacteria, it wasn't found in yogurt, is not good in your stomach. This type of bacteria led to the Black Death, which is, of course, the very dramatic name for this disease. It was actually several very similar diseases, I think, but it became a plague. That's kind of like a pandemic, a widespread, very dangerous, deadly disease. How deadly? It killed more than 20 million people throughout Europe in kind of a 10 to 20 year period, I would say, and led to all sorts of social change. So this was COVID-19 times 10,000, basically. It was probably the most dangerous or deadly disease that's ever hit human culture.
Okay, that brings us to the end of the first part of our lesson for today. Let's move on now and continue to talk about these findings from this research.
Historians have long known that 12 ships brought the plague from Crimea to Italy in 1347. However, the plague's exact origin in Asia before it was first seen in Crimea was a mystery until recently, when scientists noticed the years 1338 and 1339 on numerous tombs in 2 Kyrgyz cemeteries. The cause of death? Pestilence.
Okay, so the next paragraph here says, historians, or people who study history, have long known that 12 ships brought the plague from Crimea to Italy in 1347. So they've known about this. There were 12 ships came from Crimea, which is that peninsula in the Black Sea that Russia invaded a couple of years ago and claimed it as its own territory. It used to be part of Ukraine. But these 12 ships came from Crimea, and they sailed to Italy way back in the year 1347. So they know that, they have that information, but they probably want to know how the disease or the plague got to Crimea in the first place.
Very, very interesting. However, the plague's exact origin in Asia before it was first seen in Crimea was a mystery until recently, when scientists noticed the years 1338 and 1339 on numerous tombs in 2 Kyrgyz cemeteries. The cause of death? Pestilence. Very interesting. So this is a bit of a medical detective story here. So they didn't know exactly where the plague came from. They know it came through Crimea, but where did it come from and when did it arrive in Crimea? That was the mystery. That was the big question they were trying to answer. And then they noticed these years, 1338, 1339, and they noticed these dates on numerous tombs, a large number of people dying in a very short period of time. Yes, that is telling you something strange happened there. Maybe a war, maybe an earthquake, a natural disaster, or maybe a disease. And this was found on tombs. Well, remember we talked about graves being one spot, one hole in the ground, generally for a dead person in a cemetery. A tomb would be a small building where you might put 2 or 3 bodies, or maybe a whole family might be buried in a tomb. So it's pretty similar, but a tomb might be a bit more of a structure. It might have a door on it, something like that. But basically, it's like a grave. You will find both graves and tombs in cemeteries and graveyards. And as I said, many of these tombs and graves have dates on them, which can, of course, be very useful for historians. So this is in 2 Kyrgyz cemeteries, so 2 different places in the same part of the world, many different graves, all with similar dates on them. And they also wrote on these tombs, which they don't do today generally, they wrote the cause of death. What killed that person? Were they killed in a war? Were they killed in an accident? Were they murdered? Did they die of old age? Well, in this case, they died because of pestilence. That's just a fancy way of saying a terrible disease that spread around. So something very terrible that a lot of people were catching and dying from at the time. A lot of pestilence was around, and that's what these people died of.
So yeah, that's like an epidemic or a pandemic. It kind of means the same thing. It's not used as often, but still that is what it means. So that's interesting. Now they kind of figured out more specifically where the bubonic plague, the Black Death, came from. Okay, let's move on now to the third and final part of our lesson for today. Let's continue to talk about the science of the Black Plague.
The scientists compared DNA from the bodies in the graves with DNA from plague bacteria and found that the strain in the graves was the origin of all the strains observed thereafter. It's really like the Big Bang of plague, said study co-author Johannes Krauss from the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Germany. According to Krauss, the new evidence also suggests that Kyrgyzstan could be where the plague first jumped from animals to humans, since no earlier outbreaks among humans are known.
第3部分我们看到片语 compare A with B， 指的是将 A 与 B 做比较。我们可以说 The new building will be much nicer compared with the one that they are tearing down. 新大楼会比正在拆的那栋漂亮许多。或者我们可以说 When the photograph was compared with the painting, it was hard to tell the two apart. 这张照片和那幅画两相比较之下，很难分辨两者。最后我们可以看到名词 outbreak， 它的意思是疾病、战争等的爆发，或是突然发生。例如 After the outbreak of the new disease, many people wore masks. 新疾病爆发之后，许多人戴上口罩。或者 An outbreak of hand, foot, and mouth disease hit several schools last month. 手足口病上个月在几所学校中爆发。
Okay, so again, we've got scientists took some DNA samples there, and the scientists compared DNA from the bodies in the graves with DNA from plague bacteria and found that the strain in the graves was the origin of all the strains observed thereafter. So they did some comparing here. They compared DNA from different samples. They had DNA samples from those bodies, and they had DNA samples from plague bacteria. They compared the samples, and they concluded that the strain in the graves, the strain of the bacteria in the graves, was the origin of all the strains observed thereafter. So they could tell that strains that existed later were related to the strain in those graves. The strain of the bacteria in the graves was kind of the ancestor to all the bacteria that occurred later during the Black Plague.
So these things change over the time, but scientists can kind of trace it back through history. As this scientist says, it's really like the Big Bang of plague, said study co-author Johannes Krauss from the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Germany. He's kind of comparing it to the beginning of the universe, right? The Big Bang is the beginning of the universe and everything. So he's kind of saying it's like the beginning of all of these diseases, and certainly this whole family of diseases that we call the plague or the Black Death. It's really finding where it all kind of began, just like the Big Bang is the beginning of time. And this is from Johannes Krauss. He's from the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology. A bunch of smart people there. An institute is basically an organization that's set up probably to do some kind of service to society. We often think of institutes as being maybe a charity, maybe an NGO, one of those non-government organizations, but it's not a corporation, it's not a company. Its goal is not profit. Its goal is information and education and stuff like that. So scientists, researchers will work at an institute. You won't find a lot of salesmen working at an institute. It's more about science and research and learning. And in this case, this institute is for evolutionary anthropology. Anthropology is the study of humans as animals, basically, and evolutionary deals with changing over time. Evolutionary science would look at how monkeys became apes and apes became humans, or how animals have changed over millions and millions of years. Charles Darwin was the beginning of evolutionary science, and since then we've learned a lot about how animals and all living things really change over long periods of time, including how diseases change over long periods of time.
Right, so based on where this guy is from and what institute he represents, we can tell that Johannes Krause, I suppose that's how you pronounce it in German, is an expert and he knows what he's talking about. Now, according to Krause, the new evidence also suggests that Kyrgyzstan could be where the plague first jumped from animals to humans, since no earlier outbreaks among humans are known. And this is what we're always trying to figure out. Most of these plagues or these pandemics ultimately come from some sort of animal, whether it be a bat or a sheep or whatever, and we always want to figure out exactly when that happened. When was the jump from an animal to a human? Where did that jump occur? Just like we want to know where the jump from animals to humans occurred with COVID-19.
Absolutely. I think a lot of times back then, people lived with their animals in very small, simple dwellings. So that could have been, who knows, though. But since no earlier outbreaks among humans are known, this seems to be the beginning or the Big Bang of the Black Death. Very interesting. An outbreak is basically when a disease jumps from animals to humans and then begins to get spread around in the community, in the society. If it's only caught by a few people and they're isolated in a hospital, hopefully there won't be an outbreak. But of course, as people travel and live together and breathe and make the other people sick, an outbreak is always possible. And that's why we have to know as much as we can about these diseases, not only to learn about the past and the true course of events, but also to help us prepare for future outbreaks of other diseases which we don't even know about today.
Indeed, so we all need to be prepared, just like the Boy Scouts. Okay, that brings us to the end of our discussion for today. Let's listen now to Hanny, our Chinese teacher.
各位同学大家好，我是 Hanny。 我们来看今天的文法重点。 课文第3部分提到德国马克思普朗克学会演化人类学研究所，那这边他用到 anthropology 来指人类学。好，这个字里面的字根 anthropo 这是表达人类，那么后面的 logy 这是名词字尾，这个字尾呢常常也会拼作 ollogy， 那当它出现在表示学说、科学、主义等等的名词里，意思就是什么什么学、什么什么论，那可以用来表达一个专门学科，像 biology 就是生物学， psychology 心理学， archaeology 考古学等等。那我们把字尾 y 去掉，再加 ist 之后，可以用来表达研究该门学科的人，所以 anthropologist 那就是人类学家， biologist 生物学家， psychologist 心理学家，还有 archaeologist 就是考古学家。好，另外补充一下 philanthropist 这个字 philanthropist 这是慈善家的意思。好，那它中间的字根一样有这个 anthrop 表示人类，前面的字首 phil 表示爱，那么字尾 ist 表示从事什么什么的人。好，或者是说 ist 可以表达遵从某种学说啊，或是信仰的人。同学们就可以试着联想啦，慈善家是会从事慈善行为、投身慈善事业的人，那这种人通常就是热爱人类、有大爱的人。如果我们把这个 philanthropist 这个 ist 改成名词字尾 y， 会得到 philanthropy， 这个名词就表示慈善事业、慈善行为。好，那课文下一句接着用到 according to 什么什么来表达根据什么什么的说法，那这边我们就来补充片语介系词 according to 的不同意思。那第一种就是课文用法，可以表达根据什么所说，依照什么所记载，那后面可以接人或是事物来说明来源或是出处。举例来说 according to legend Kissing the stone will bring you good luck. 根据传说，亲吻那颗石头会带来好运哦。好，那第二个呢，我们可以用 according to 去表达依照什么什么的指示，那后面通常就是会接规则啊、说明等等。例如 Please install the software according to the instructions on the website. 请依照网站上的指示说明来安装软体。那第三个，我们可以用 according to 去表达取决于什么，根据什么而定，后面常常就会接某一种分类评量的标准咯。像如果我们说 organize your closet according to color， 就表示根据颜色来整理衣柜。好，以上是今天重点整理，我们回顾今天单字吧。
Analyze. If we analyze the problem carefully, I'm sure we can find a solution. Cemetery.The cemetery is located next to a hospital and a public park. Grave. A grave was freshly dug in preparation for the funeral. Strain. The farmer grew a successful crop with the new strain of corn. Tomb. The king's tomb was built using large flat stones. Institute. His wife works at an institute that studies information security.
Discussion Starter starts now!
Here's our discussion starter for today. The question is, would you be interested in solving other mysteries of disease origins? Why or why not?
I would like to solve other mysteries of disease origins because I like puzzles, I like history. I think this stuff is very interesting and useful. I'm not sure I have the brain to do all of the difficult biology, but I do find stories like this or documentaries about issues like this, whether it's Black Death, COVID, Ebola, where they came from, and sort of the scientific detectives who are out there in the world trying to figure these things out. I do find it all very interesting, but I'm not saying I have the brain for it.
Well, it does sound interesting, but I don't have the brain for it. I would not be interested in solving other mysteries of disease origins, since I don't have a strong background in microbiology or with diseases and things like that. I would definitely have to go back to college and study something like that in order to try to trace the origins of diseases, and I just don't have the money and the time to do that.
Well, that brings us to the end of another edition of our program, and please make sure you join us again next time. From all of us here, I am Mike.
I am Roger. See you next time.